Today on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, we're doing something a little different. We're going to take a break from our Year of Homer and have an interview with Joshua Charles. You might know him from Twitter or X, where he shares a lot of wisdom from the early church fathers. We're going to discuss with him his conversion. We're going to discuss the early church fathers, his love of them, and how they kind of parallel his own political journey. And we're going to talk to him about his new project, Eternal Christendom, and the beautiful media and books and treasuries of the past that they are trying to bring to people. And we'll have a short discussion at the end on St. Augustine and true religion. So join us today for a good conversation with Joshua Charles on Ascend the Great Books podcast.
Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. I'm Adam Minahan, and welcome to this special edition of Ascend, the Great Books podcast. It may be the first one that we've ever done, kind of out of our routine, out of the norm or the ordo of Ascend, the Great Books podcast. We're here with, as always, Deacon Harrison Garlick. Lord Chancellor, it's good to see you.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah. But this is right. This is like the first one of. Is this the first one that we've done?
I think so. Like we've got usually we're doing our slow simmer burn through our Year of Homer and working through that. But this is actually our first topical episode in which we invite a guest on and discuss something that's I think interesting, but outside of our typical Great Books reading schedule.
Yeah, that's gonna be fun. And our guest is.
I'm honored to be number one. We'll see if it ends up being worth it or if it's a crash and burn. So
we'll just delete the episode and it'll never see the light of day. So it'll be good. But as you've heard, we have a wonderful guest on today to join Adam and I. We have Mr. Joshua Charles. He is a Catholic convert. He's a former White House speechwriter, #1 New York Times author, historian, concert pianist, a JD, and founder and president of Eternal Christendom. So, Joshua, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Deacon. And you're a lawyer as well, right?
I am. Yes, I didn't know you had your JD. Did you practice law?
But no, I haven't taken a bar exam, so I say I'm only half as annoying because of that.
Okay.
So
that just means you're smarter than me. You got the JD.
No, I would. I went to law school without the intention to practice. I'll just say I was covered financially, so I didn't have any debt coming out, and so it was a great training, super helpful for helping you to learn how to think. A wise friend of mine who went to law school many years ago, he told me that basically whatever you go into law school with will just come out more when you're done, and that's essentially what happened. And so it was a great training, and wasn't a Catholic school. I went to a Protestant evangelical school. There were some Catholic professors there, and they covered, the whole history of law and natural law. We had a lot of Aquinas stuff, Christian worldview stuff. So that was another reason I went there, and it was a good, very, very good choice and great faculty, Regent University, for people who are wondering. So,
oh, wonderful.
We smoked the Ivy Leagues in all the legal competitions. So yeah, but anyway, I'm only half as annoying because I didn't do a bar exam. So,
well, I'm very happy to be fully annoying. So that's good.
That's what Adam was telling me. No, I'm just kidding.
I didn't say that. I didn't say it.
Fully annoying. Yeah.
No, that's good.
Lawyers and language. Yeah. You got to watch out.
Yeah. I do have a day job outside of doing the podcast of running HR, legal, child protection, insurance. There are plenty of people who would say I'm annoying. So
yeah.
So Joshua, you're going to parse out some of these. I was looking at your longer bio on Eternal Christendom, which we'll get to discuss your new project, which I'm excited to discuss. But you're going to parse out some of these books. So you've written a lot more books than I realized. Like, can you hit the high points here and tell us some of the works that you have?
Yeah, the first one that got everything going, it's kind of a crazy story. I can give a very short version, but in 2010, there was some legislation being passed. Not to get too political, but Obamacare. I'm a more politically conservative person. I was concerned with the direction of the country, and I had just finished reading the Federalist Papers for maybe the second or third time, as normal people are wont to do. I'm just kidding. And I was thinking, man, it'd be really wonderful if Americans could read this, because I feel like they would much better understand the Constitution but unfortunately the English is prohibitively difficult, I think, for most Americans. 18th century stuff. I've gotten used to it because I've read a lot of documents from that time period. So you just get used to it. Just like, riding a bike. At first it's really hard, but you do it a little bit and you know what you're doing. So anyway, I was thinking, I wonder if I could like somehow, and I was hesitant to do this because it seems kind of presumptuous, but I also thought it could be done. I thought to myself, I wonder if I could go like sentence by sentence and translate it into a more contemporary English that was much more readable and preserve the meaning. And literally a few days later, Glenn Beck on Fox News at the time, literally 3 days later, he was on the show and he said, somebody needs to take the Federalist Papers and like translate it into contemporary English, so it's more understandable. So that was in March of 2010. Decided I needed to get it done and I would get it to him. Took that whole summer, did it. I normally go home, but I didn't go home that summer, so I could just work on it. I literally went through my whole Federalist Papers. It's about a 500-page book, numbered every sentence with superscripts and whatnot. And then in my Word document, went line by line, all the numbers, so I knew exactly where I was, and I would remove the numbers afterward. And so kind of like Bible chapter and verses, but for the Federalist Papers. And anyway, I almost got it to him. I was waiting in the radio show to be interviewed, but the screener didn't get me quite on. And when I met him in person in New York City the following year, he's like, "I remember you." I'm like, "Yeah, you could have gotten this done a lot sooner, buddy." We were joking, of course. But anyway, through a very, very unlikely set of circumstances, long story short, Glenn had gone to a town in Ohio called Wilmington, and they had a prayer movement thing going. It had been really hit hard by the financial crisis. So there were these great ministries that were feeding the homeless every day, and there was a 24/7 prayer house sort of thing. And I was still Protestant at the time. Wonderful people, and so me and a few fraternity brothers, we started a Christian fraternity. You guys may be familiar with it, Bucks, Brothers Under Christ. I know that there's some Oklahoma universities that have it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay. So we started a chapter at KU, University of Kansas. So I'm actually, that's my adopted state, Kansas. So I'm actually a little closer to you guys than normal. I'm in California now, which is my home state, the People's Republic. And so anyway, we decided to go out there over Christmas break and do some volunteer work just for fun. And when I went out there, I met some great people. And as we were driving back from Ohio to Kansas, getting on I-70 west, I got a call from New York, and they said, "Hey, we heard about you guys. They're going to do an update episode on Glenn's show on Fox News. Would you want to come on and tell us like what the heck these Christian fraternity guys are doing coming to Wilmington, Ohio?" I was like, "Sure." So the following week I was in New York. They didn't have any idea about the book, but I printed it out. It was like this thick, maybe about an inch. I put a hardcover binding around it. And before we started recording the Fox News show, I went up to Glenn and I said, "Hey, you said something, we should do this, so here you go." He wasn't expecting to see that. And he was like, "Wow, if this is any good, we'll publish it." Well, that's the short version of the story. They did. And of course, because of his name, it went to a #1 New York Times bestseller for several weeks. And so anyway, that just kind of got everything going as far as, some legitimacy, getting my foot in the door. And I was able to do some stuff with the American founders, some scholarship over 5 years, which led to other books on the founding, which led to stuff at the Museum of the Bible, which led to the Church Father. So I actually think it's the origin of me becoming Catholic in many ways, because I got really, really deep into original sources. And I actually had a law school dean who was raised Catholic. He was Presbyterian at the time when I started law school. This would have been in 2014. And he is now, I think, Eastern Orthodox. So I'm almost back home. But he said to me in 2014, if you do with the Church Fathers what you did with the Founding Fathers, you'll probably end up Catholic. And I didn't even know who the Church Fathers were. And I'm, I joke with him, I was just thinking in my head, okay, freak. And so, but he ended up being right, of course. I didn't start reading the Fathers till 3 years later in 2017. But yeah, the thing with Glenn really got things going. And then most recently, edited a volume that I encountered, auspiciously enough, during the COVID lockdowns, called "The War of the Antichrist with the Church and Christian Civilization." It's about Freemason. I'm sorry?
published by Tan, correct?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
but it was written by Monsignor George Dillon in the 1880s. So I wrote it. It's about Freemasonry essentially and what its designs are for the world. And so not to get too deep into a rabbit hole, literally or otherwise. But Pope Leo XIII endorsed this specific book, and it read like prophecy, especially when I was reading it during the lockdowns, which I had come into the church the previous July 2019, so not at Easter. So 2020 was going to be my first Easter as a Catholic. Didn't get to do it. So, but I did know from my reading of the Fathers, per session 4 of the Council of Trent says that the unanimous consensus of the Fathers on Scripture is binding, so infallible. And the Fathers are unanimous that one of the things Antichrist will do is bring the public sacrifice of the Mass to an end for 3.5 years. So I was carefully watching the calendar, seeing how long this thing went. But it certainly struck me as a type of that. And so anyway, not to get into that topic either, but that's when I discovered this book, and it was an extremely prophetic book. And so, yeah, I encourage people to read it. Deacon, you post a ton of stuff about political philosophy that we're completely synced on. And, basically a very, very short summary here is essentially Christian civilization, Catholic civilization is based on nature joining with grace, essentially. And liberal civilization, in many ways, it can rightly be called Freemasonic civilization, which Monsignor Dillon and Pope Leo XIII use as a term for essentially occultism, any form of occult society. So you don't have to be like a card-carrying Freemason to be a Freemason in this lingo. But it's essentially a civilization that's based off the opposite principle of separating nature and grace, whether it's in education or family life or church-state relations and things like that. So very prophetic book. So I just wrote a pretty extensive introduction for that, edited up a little bit. Monsignor Dillon made a few statements that were slightly off. It wasn't significant, but we corrected that. I put a footnote and whatnot. So, and then the most recent one is called Persecuted from Within, How the Saints Endured Crises in the Church. This was written with a former White House colleague of mine, Alec Torres. And it was his idea, actually. He asked me to be involved. But basically it profiles, I believe, 12 saints, technically one blessed, Venerable Fulton Sheen, or Venerable. And basically how they had to endure being persecuted from within the church, including by members of the hierarchy, sometimes popes, sometimes bishops, sometimes religious superiors, things like that. And just the lessons to be learned from that, because I know many people are concerned about some of what's going on now. Not going to get into it here. It's not what this episode's about, but it really shows what a saintly response is, even when things like that are happening. And the idea, as Catholics, I joked with this colleague at the White House. I said, it really sucks to be Catholic because we can't complain about suffering anymore. And so I learned from these saints and from the Fathers in general that when we take up the cross, we're not just taking it up because, with disease and just the natural tragedies of life that are going to happen anyway. And we're not just taking it up because of the external enemies that are going to attack us. We're taking it up because of the internal wolves as well that are going to attack us. And Judah had all sorts of problems, but you wanted to be with Judah, not the 10 tribes, because they were completely wiped out. And Judah always remained the bearer of God's promises to David in 2 Samuel 7. So yeah, you want to be with Judah, which is typologically is the Catholic Church. So you want to be with the Catholic Church, you want to be with the family, but it's going to be rough sometimes, and it has been rough sometimes, and that's okay. That's when saints are made. So anyway, that's the most recent book. And then right now, Scott Hahn and I are working on a book on the American founding, kind of in the shadow of Christendom. I'm sure everybody will be thrilled by what we have to say. We're going to talk about some good natural elements of the American order. I will say this: the opening chapter is about patriotism and how it's a virtue, and how we can't apply the genetic fallacy to our country and therefore say we are exempt from the demands of a particular virtue. Even God's family, when you look at the patriarchs, if anybody's read Genesis, it's one family drama episode after another and with the patriarchs, but that was still God's family. And so the same applies to our country as well. It's a similar idea. You owe piety to your spiritual fathers, your earthly father, and to your country. And there's no there's no exemption clause in any of those commandments. So,
Yeah,
so
that actually dovetail really well into our conversations that we're having on the Iliad right now in our year of
oh,
Homer.
really?
Yeah, because one of the first times you see that threefold piety, even like in a pagan sense, is when Hector goes back to Troy, and he shows he has that piety, that gratitude to the gods, to his polis, right? So there's a
Yep.
patriotism, and then to his family, right? That he has
Okay.
that, and they have to be not only do they exist, but they have to exist in hierarchy, right? So the
Mm.
higher governs the lower, and that's actually a lot of tension with Hector. Is if his family at one point in the book, his family cries out for him like not to fight anymore, or his wife actually tempts him to hold back, and he has piety towards his family and towards his parents, but that is subordinate to say the piety towards the polis and ultimately the piety he owes the gods. And
Yep.
so, yeah, even in this pagan sense, you see very quickly that patriotism is a virtue, right?
Yeah. We have received benefits from our country we can never fully repay, and
Correct.
that doesn't mean that its governing regime need be perfect. You're a father, Adam. You're a father, I believe, right?
A
I mean,
five.
you guys. I'm sure you guys are great fathers, but you're not perfect fathers. But that doesn't exempt your kids from the fourth commandment. So
Yeah.
Right. No, I
same
think
with
it's
the clergy.
no, it's a beautiful concept. I think because I've really enjoyed kind of brokering that subject in my own political writings and even talking around the diocese. Usually, no one wants to talk about politics until it's an election season. Then all of a sudden, we get asked to come talk about
Just
politics.
in time.
I know. It's like, should we study for the test, like, ahead of time or right before we have to take it? Let's do it right before we have to take it
Yeah.
whenever the questions are lit. So, one of the things, though, that I find really interesting is that today, we only talk about rights. We only talk about
Yeah.
what we're owed. And I love balancing this out with the ancients, who also had a concept of right, a use, right, which contextualized differently than we would think about it as individual rights. But they're always balanced with the piety, the gratitude, right? And as you mentioned, yeah, the baby who's born right into the polis is immediately taking from the common good, a common good that they have not contributed to,
Yeah.
right? So their parents are taking care of them, in a modern day setting, like the hospital they have, the society that they live in. There's all these things that children, as they grow up into adolescence, take from
Mm-hmm.
society. And it was such an ancient concept that, like, okay, when you become an adult, you have to pay off that debt, right?
Mm-hmm.
You owe this to the common good of the polis. Now you contribute for the sake of others. And I think that it's so hard for us to understand a politics that's predicated on gratitude.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Well, I forget who said it. Maybe it was Roger Scruton or Russell Kirk or something. But he said, I think it was Russell Kirk in the conservative mind. One of his, I forget how many it was, like I don't know, 10 or 12 features. He was trying to describe the essence of conservatism, and I think the first or second one was gratitude. Like you have to have a sense of gratitude, and gratitude doesn't mean everything's wonderful. It means you appreciate what you've been given, and you can only rightly approach it and make it better if you appreciate it. And
Yep.
on the piety thing, when it comes to fathers, I'll tell you a verse that really changed my life coming into the church was from a book I formerly thought was apocryphal, Sirach 3. I come from a divorced family and I have a good relationship with both my parents, but because of that, it's had some issues here and there. And Sirach 3, I can't quote it from memory. I probably should commit it to memory, but it basically talks about honoring your father. It says your father's dishonor is no honor to you. And there's a line in there about in all your strength, do not abhor your father, and even if he lacks forbearance, in all your strength, do not despise him. I think that's how it phrases it.
Mhm.
And even if somebody doesn't think that's a divinely revealed text, the psychological wisdom of it is astounding. That even if you have parents, I'm not saying this about my parents, but even if you have parents who have objectively done unjust things, what would that be? Unjust, yeah. But even if you have if you indulge in despising them, like something truly toxic has gotten into your soul. Even if injustice, there's a sense in which they deserve it. And so anyway, I found Sirach 3 to be extremely helpful whenever I'm tempted to to indulge that temptation when it comes to things with parents. And I think I've shared it with a lot of friends, and it's been very helpful for them too. So yeah,
Well, that's
piety,
good.
country, family, and church. So
Yeah, because the natural, right, when you have that piety and we're kind of habituated to it, both the church and the state are built off the same unit. They're both built off the family. And so what's interesting is that if you unfortunately are in a situation in which you owe piety and respect and gratitude to your parents, but your parents act, with a certain injustice, they act unjustly, then what's interesting about navigating that and being virtuous in that scenario, which requires a lot of prudence, is it
Mhm.
also then prepares you then on how you handle, say, bad politicians, right? Bad people that have an office worthy of respect, or even how we handle bad clergy, right? Whether it's deacon, priest, bishop, etc., that doesn't seem to be living up to their office. It's that same mechanism that kicks in of like, okay, I owe a piety here, but in a certain way, right, then I have to be guarded and there's a prudence that kicks in and et cetera. So it's
Yeah.
interesting how nature serves there as a teacher for the two societies that are built upon that family. I do want to go back though, because I thought it was really fascinating what you said earlier about that if I understood you correctly, that your political awakening, I guess if you want to call it that, parallels your church awakening by both going back to the sources, right?
Yeah.
So you look at in the political, you go back to the Federalist Papers. In the church world, right, and the ecclesial, you're returning to the early church fathers. So this is how I think I came to know you. I think this is how probably a lot of people, at least on X, have come to
Hmm.
know you, right? Is it just, every day you're on X sharing the wisdom of the fathers, right? And
Yeah.
I see you heaving out this treasure trove every day and kind of sharing these little gems with
Yeah.
people, I think in palatable ways. So can you kind of go back to that and talk a little bit about falling in love with the fathers and then what kind of led you to have such a profound Twitter ministry? It sounds so weird to say an X ministry. It just sounds
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
keep it to one. Otherwise, it'll get really interesting.
Yeah,
Uh,
Joshua, let me
yeah.
piggyback off that just really quick because I'm just curious because I mean my question was going to be actually piggybacking off of Deacons is as you are a Protestant reading these early church fathers and you're reading history, you're as a historian, did this obviously as you're reading through the history of the church, you come across different scandals and things that early church fathers had to deal with.
Oh yeah.
Did the early scandals or did the scandals of past church history prohibit you or help you become Catholic?
No, they helped actually. That's a great question. No, they helped. Do you mind if I come to that after answering Deacons? Because I think it would
Yeah, I
flow.
just didn't want to forget. Sorry, I'm like short-term
Yeah,
memory
no,
ADD. So
totally.
I wanted to get that out there.
No. I'm very similar. So yeah, I'll because Deacons is more general. Yeah, I would say my journey to the Catholic Church began as a Protestant because I love the Bible, and the more closely I read Scripture, the less Protestant ideas made sense. And I wasn't thinking of them for much of my childhood as Protestant. And throughout pretty much the whole time until I started reading the Fathers in 2017, I never once remotely considered the Catholic Church because it's really stunning looking back on it. I really did inherit a set of prejudices that I simply wasn't willing to reconsider when it came to the Catholic Church. And the Fathers, God slapped me in the face with the Church Fathers, especially. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to interject very fast because we do have you're kind of working through Homer. Obviously, we come very strongly from a Catholic intellectual tradition to look at the great books, but we also have a lot of non-Catholics that follow us, and even non-Christians that are following along in our year of Homer.
Yeah.
So keep going on the path you're going, but can you give us the working definition of like an early church father? Like, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah. Basically, a church father would be. There's a stricter definition and a looser definition. The stricter definition would be those that essentially the early ecumenical councils recognized as fathers. I believe the Fifth Ecumenical Council, I'm forgetting about the others at the moment, but several ecumenical councils recognized fathers, East and West, St. Augustine, St. Basil, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, and St. Pope Gregory the Great, St. Pope Leo the Great, guys like this, who it calls the fathers, and it says that they follow their doctrine in all things. That's how the Fifth Ecumenical Council phrases it. So that'd be the stricter definition. I like the looser definition because you'll see many of them refer to the Holy Fathers. Like Athanasius uses this term all the time, and he's not just talking about specific church fathers. He's talking about all the bishops who've succeeded from the apostles and have passed on apostolic doctrine and affirmed it and taught it and done so faithfully. So pretty much you could say just generally a church father is an ancient Christian church leader who in some sense was renowned for their doctrine. You could pretty much say that. Many of them were martyrs. Many of them were red martyrs, as we say in the Catholic Church, red being, obviously they had to shed their blood. Others were white martyrs, which is they had to go through something like exile or imprisonment or something like that. St. John Chrysostom and Athanasius are examples of white martyrdom. Athanasius was exiled from his see in Alexandria, Egypt, at least 5 times. Chrysostom, excuse me. I forget how many times he was exiled, but a lot. And so anyway, that would be an example of white martyrdom. But I basically consider it a church father if essentially they're a saint, if the church recognizes them as a saint, which basically the Catholic list and the Eastern Orthodox list are perfectly aligned for pretty much almost the whole first millennium. And so that's essentially what I consider a church father. So an example of 2 prominent figures who wouldn't be church fathers, I think they're important witnesses to certain doctrines, but Origen and Tertullian, neither were recognized as saints for various reasons. We don't need to get into that. They're prominent, and I do think they say some important things that are very important witnesses to Catholic belief. But they're not saints, and they're not church fathers. The term I've heard applied to them is ecclesiastical writers. And so, yeah.
That's a good save. I like that.
Well,
Yeah,
I personally think Origen did die in the peace of the church. There's an interesting line. See, let me back up really quick. The point I'm going to make is when you actually dive into the sources, it's so much more interesting than when you read secondary sources. I think secondary sources can be very important. If you want a quick summary of something, scholarship of something, great. That can be helpful. I'm not saying no. But it's so much more interesting when you read original sources. And so I'll come back to that theme, but the quick example I was going to give was there's a kind of a throwaway line. St. Jerome and Rufinus were having a row about Origenism, the doctrines of Origen. And Rufinus has this throwaway line at the end of his apology to Jerome. And he says, "You, Jerome, told me that Origen recanted his errors to Fabian." And who's Fabian? He's a pope. So a pope of Rome. So Rufinus has this sort of throwaway line about an Eastern theologian recanting his errors to the Pope of Rome. So this would have been in the 200s. So again, most people, I've never seen that quote pop up, but when you actually read the works in full, you find stuff like that all the time. And so anyway, just another example of it. So yeah, I started reading the Founding Fathers as a result of that book. I'd read a decent amount of them, did the Fellow's Papers. I spent 5 years. I had an academic fellowship that some donors supported, and I literally, actually this bookshelf right here, that whole thing is original sources for America, and like the first 4 or 5 shelves, that's all Lincoln up there. This is all Founding Fathers, and probably a few more Founding Fathers, and there's a few more Founding Fathers down there. So I've read pretty much all of it, and so what I discovered was the Founding Fathers were way more interesting when you actually read their diaries and their letters and their whatever. And, kind of growing up in a Reaganite conservative household, the Founding Fathers are kind of vaunted as these great figures. And many of them were, in a natural sense. I think many of them were. But there were just a lot of things I discovered in the Founding Fathers that wouldn't have jived very well. Is it jived or jived? I think it's jived. Sorry. Sometimes I throw out these words and I rarely think about them. Wait. What is it?
Just say it with confidence and just
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, anyway, so like an example would be many of the Founding Fathers expressed great trepidation about excessive prosperity and luxury and the effects it would have on American society. That's not something you'll ever hear in modern politics. Everything's always about the economy, stupid, right? As I think James Carville, the Democratic strategist, strategist said about Clinton in the 92 election, or said to Clinton. And so you certainly weren't going to hear that on the Republican side. The Reagan, I mean, we just kind of assumed more prosperity, the better. There's no hint of suspicion that sometimes we can be too wealthy for our own good, and that wealth can actually lead to the decay of freedom and ordered liberty. But one of the things I would do at the White House, it's either, when you're a speechwriter, it's either 0 or 100. And if you happen to not be with the president or the vice president that day, and you're just back at the White House, it tends to be a slower day. So what I would do in those days when I was there is I would read Roman history. So I read a lot of Sallust, and I finished up Polybius. He's a Greek, but he was writing about the Roman Empire. Read a lot of Livy. I still have more Livy to finish, but I read a lot of Livy. Livy is very clear. Sallust is very clear. I would say Juvenal is very clear. Not a historian, but a satirist. That once Rome conquered, in particular, its eastern provinces, this wealth and all this luxury, all these exotic items and animals and furs and perfumes and all these things, it fed this appetite for luxury. And when you're fed this appetite for luxury, you become consumed with the pursuit of material things, and you forget your principles, you forget your values, so to speak. I generally don't like that word values. I don't think it's kind of meaningless, but you know what I mean. So anyway, this was all extremely interesting stuff, and I found a lot of lines in those writings that were just powerful lines that you never hear at like a Tea Party convention or something like that. Not because they wouldn't like it, but because no one's reading this stuff. Nobody's diving into the actual sources. So one example, I'll try and do it from memory. There was a letter from Abigail Adams to John Quincy Adams when he had just gone over to France with John Adams, his father, and he went with him because John wanted him to learn diplomacy and languages and things like that. And which he turned out to be a congressman, a secretary of state, and a president. So I'd say he did pretty well. And so anyway, John Quincy Adams is, I think he's like 12 or 13, something like that. And his mother writes to him, and she says something to the effect of, I'd rather you have drowned in the ocean you've just crossed than grow up to be an immoral, profligate, graceless child. Something like that. That's a powerful line. It really makes you like they meant it. And while that may be a bit harsh, there's some very important truths in that. And you'll see many of these beautiful lines about virtue and religion. Now, their view of religion is not, Thomistic or Catholic per se, but it has obviously elements of truth, certainly on the natural religion side. So anyway, that's why this law professor said if you dive into the founding fathers, if you do the same thing with the church fathers, you'll probably end up Catholic. So anyway, doing that with the founding fathers made me realize how much deeper one could learn about the past and learn all this profound wisdom by diving into the actual sources. And so, so when the opportunity came to do that with the church fathers, it was very much welcomed by me. Although when I initially started, I wasn't expecting to find the Catholic Church. I was expecting to find Christians who were basically like me, with some cool martyrdom stories. That's literally what I expected to find. I certainly found cool, I wouldn't use that word, but some very profound and inspiring martyrdom stories. But I found Christians who were completely and totally unlike me in many regards. And in fact, they were like those pagan idolaters, the Catholics, kind of everywhere I looked. So this was very concerning, So, and when it came to, I can answer more questions about the conversion if you want, but to go back to your question, Adam. Yeah, I mean, I was on with Keith Little recently, the Cordial Catholic, and he asked, this issue came up. I think sometimes among some Protestants, there's this complete and total caricature about converts. Like, you just think that it'll resolve everything to join the Catholic Church. Like, it just answers all your questions. First, I've never met a convert who thinks that way. I'm sure they're out there, but I've never met one yet. So and I've met a lot, so I don't know. Second, it's like that played literally zero role in my conversion. In fact, it was the opposite. I saw how many crises the church had gone through and how essentially whenever the dust settled, and sometimes dust was, put into the air and things were a bit unclear. There was a time with Athanasius where it appeared that Pope Liberius had caved to a semi-Arian creed. That's a serious thing. Now, St. Athanasius defended his orthodoxy, and it became clear that Liberius had done so under duress, and he cleared it all up after he was outside the clutches of the emperor. So all was well. But there was a time where you can imagine in a period where communication is very slow, travel is very slow. You may hear the first part of the news, but you're not going to hear this. You may not hear the second part, and if you do, you're not going to hear it for quite a while. But how even in the midst of that, when the dust settled, the church was still the flocks under the bishops who'd succeeded from the apostles in communion with the successor of Peter in Rome. Like, it's so simple. It really is incredibly simple. And I was very open to Eastern Orthodoxy. I just didn't find it in the fathers. The more councils I read, you'll find times where in the fathers where they perhaps don't advert to Rome as quickly as we would today. I think that would be a fair observation. But again, I think a lot of that is simply technology and communication. When technology and communication prevents instantaneous communication, and you and I, we could all be in Europe in a few hours. It's astounding. Like if we had a plane schedule, we could hop on it. We're there in a few hours. Like it would take months for these guys to get from Italy to Greece sometimes, or at the very least weeks. And so, and that's assuming there's no barbarians in the way, or the Eastern Emperor is not fighting with the Western Emperor and things like that. So, especially in a situation like that, you want to take care of things at the local level as much as possible, and that happened a lot. And frankly, Deacon, you would know better than me, but it still seems like the vast majority of the church's business is still taken care of at the local level. There's a lot that Rome is involved with, of course, but they're not like micromanaging you, in the vast majority, I think. Maybe you would have stories, but yeah, in general, they don't micromanage. There are rules, there are guidelines, and you can be called to, you can be summoned to appear in some sort of dispute. Well, guess what? That happened all over the ancient church. Who was it? I'm forgetting that Pope Julius. He summoned Athanasius and the guys who were making accusations against him. I mean, popes have been summoning people. It's like they've always had that authority from the beginning. So anyway, but I just didn't find Eastern Orthodoxy there. The papacy was just acknowledged too strongly, too consistently, too often to take Eastern Orthodoxy seriously. And I love the Eastern Orthodox. I'm actually reading the Catechism of, they call him a saint, Philaret of Moscow. I think he was the Patriarch of Moscow in maybe the 1800s. And I'm just out of curiosity. I know it's kind of a standard Eastern Orthodox catechism. I'm kind of curious, and its paragraphs are numbered. So I'm curious to see how many paragraphs I can get and be like, yep, we can agree with that. We can agree with that. It's well north of 95% so far. And so there's so much we agree on that I'm thankful for, and I don't look down on them. But yeah, I just didn't find the historical backing in the fathers.
So for people that, because I had a similar experience when I read the early church fathers. I was a Protestant. I was studying at a Protestant university. I grew
Which
up
one?
in Oral Roberts University.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Very Catholic. I'm just kidding.
I think there's about 2 people there out of 5,000
Wow.
students. So, I think that, one of the things that did really strike me, because I was not looking for Catholicism. I really was not. But that's really what struck me, is reading the early church fathers and realizing, not at first like, oh, this is Catholicism. Like that wasn't my initial take. My initial take was just like, this doesn't look like my faith. And that's what bothered me the most.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't that I immediately was like, who's right? The Pope.
Yeah.
What my initial take was just simply, these guys are talking about the Eucharistic sacrifice. There's altars, there's bishops, and their pursuit of holiness being articulated via virtue and things like that were very different than what I grew into. And it still took me several more years of studying. Joshua, you bump into someone in the street, they're like, oh yeah, I know you. You're on Twitter and you share all the early church fathers things. And they say like, hey, real quick, like what's the 3 early church father texts I should probably start with?
What would I say?
Yeah, what would you say?
Well, I'm certain about one, maybe two, but I'm not sure if I'd be certain about the third one because there's so many great ones. I would say the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch. These are actually probably going to be the ones we focus on first, these three, for Eternal Christendom, to produce samples and whatnot, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was ordained by St. Peter. He knew St. John. He wrote in the early 2nd century, so about AD 107. So, we're talking within 60, 70 years of our Lord's ascension. There's a fascinating description in Irenaeus. Was it Irenaeus? Yes, I think Irenaeus of Lyon, who's in the latter half of the 2nd century, so the 180s or so, he knew St. Polycarp, and St. Polycarp knew St. Ignatius of Antioch. But it's so cool. I was reading it the other day. St. Irenaeus is recalling how Polycarp was telling him about the apostles themselves. I mean, I get chills thinking about it. Could you imagine what that would be like? I seriously have chills. It's like, I was reading it, I was like, wow. And Polycarp knew Ignatius. And they have a letter between them. And because Polycarp was at Smyrna as well, which is close to Antioch, relatively. And so anyway, that's how close we're talking here. And so Ignatius, like Polycarp, even earlier than Polycarp, would have known more of the apostles. I think by the time Polycarp was alive, some of them were dead, but he certainly knew John, And so that's how close we're talking. And so his letters, there's about 6 or 7 letters that he's writing to churches. He's being taken from Antioch in modern-day Turkey to Rome, where he was martyred in the Colosseum. They're they're relatively short. I think all 6 together, maybe a little less than 20,000 words. So, which sounds like a lot, but that's like a evening read. So that one. I think the next best one is for converts would be AD 434, St. Vincent of Lerins, the Commonitorium. And so at the beginning, it's funny because the night before I read this one, this would have been in about October 2017. I started reading the Fathers in June of 2017. And essentially what had happened was I was at the Museum of the Bible. Excuse my voice. I'm still recovering from some allergy sinus stuff. I had finished the main project I was on, which was a big Bible project, which ended up being it was called the Global Impact Bible. And, to print such a big book, you've got to finish the manuscript, then you've got a few months to print. And the building of the DC Museum was going to open in November 2017. So we finished in May, building's going to open in November. And so my boss was like, Josh, everyone's 100% focused on making sure the building in DC is done. So research what you want, and we'll make it into exhibits once we're open. It's like, you can imagine what that was like for a bibliophile like myself. So a good salary, benefits, and a free hand to research whatever I want. So I had always seen this multi-volume set of the Fathers, so I got it. It's right over here. The 38-volume Schaff set, ironically put together by a Protestant. So anyway, so I started reading in June, and so this is October, and this is the first time I asked Our Lady for her prayers, and I was still very nervous about it. And I looked up at the ceiling in my room, and I just said, Mary. I was very sheepish about it, and I was still not. I was intellectually there. I didn't see how it didn't make sense, but it was so unnatural for me. So anyway, I basically said, if this is your son's church, please confirm it for me as soon as possible, because this is getting agonizing. And then I literally prayed, Jesus, if I just committed idolatry, please forgive me. And so literally the next day, I saw a quote from St. Vincent's Commonitory. And the quote was just stunningly Catholic. And it was not only stunningly, it said something about the Catholic Church that was very Catholic in its own right, in terms of what it was affirming. But the part of the quote described how heretics operate. And essentially what it described heretics doing in AD 434 is exactly what we Protestants did. Basically, we're all taking scripture, we're taking it out of the church, and we're interpreting it on our own without the church's authority. I was like, that's literally what we do. And that's how it all started. And so anyway, I was like, this has been going on a lot longer than before the 16th century. So the other thing, Adam, to go back to your question about conflicts in the church, I think there's this idea, you sometimes hear this idea, and I'm going to, sorry, this is a very long way of saying what the 3 works should be, but I do think there is this idea that some people have that the first 1,000 years was some like utopia of church unity. That's ridiculous. It's utterly absurd. Now there was the Catholic Church, like today, it's the vast majority of Christians. I say we're about 51% of Christians. It was the vast plural. By far, if you're going to put all the denominations, the church is not a denomination, but for lack of a better term, if you're going to put them all the church is by far the biggest. There's not even a close second. And that was the case in the first millennium. But the fathers are constantly describing all these heretical groups and schismatic groups that are separating from the church. They're interpreting scripture on their own. They're rejecting the church's authority. They're disagreeing sometimes with the church's canon. That was the Marcions and a few other heresies. The Marcionites rejected the Old Testament. So anyway, this was not just 16th century stuff. This was literally from day one of the church. So St. Vincent describes all of this in great detail. He at the opening of the work, it's about 35 pages of small font. So I finished it in one night, but I had to put it down multiple times. I saw this quote, and I was like, I wonder if that book is in my 38 volume set, and it was. So I was like, I'm going to read the whole thing tonight, and I did. But I had to set it down multiple times because my heart was literally pounding. I was like, it's stunningly Catholic, and everything it's describing as heretical and schismatic is what I thought was normal Christianity. It very sobering, and but the opening of the work is basically he wants to know how he can know what the Catholic faith is, and he says the answer I've been universally given is Scripture, tradition, and the authority of the Church. It's like, who would have thought, So anyway, the commentary. So St. Ignatius of Antioch's letter, the commentary. As for a third one for converts, I don't know. That'd be maybe the one we're going to talk about in a bit here of true religion. Maybe that one, because it's got a lot of really. Again, it describes behavior among heretics and schismatics that is still true today. It describes the Catholic faith in a way that is completely compatible with the Catholic Church and faith today. So maybe that one, but that third one, I'd have to think about it a little. Do you have one in mind, or one that you read that you thought would be really good?
Yeah, there's a few. I think the one though that I think really kind of shocked me was you actually mentioned him, Saint Irenaeus.
Yes.
In his work against heresies.
Oh yeah. Yep.
So in that work, one thing I would highlight there is he's in the 200s. So still very, very
No, this is about 180.
Oh,
against heresy is about 80, 180. Yeah.
So even before that.
Yeah.
So he's, I think that was something that struck me is about how early this is, particularly when you look at like the Council of Nicaea is like in 325. So like when we're talking about the history of the church, this is very, very early. And one of the things that really struck me in that text was his comparisons between the Blessed Virgin Mary and Eve.
Yep.
And that's where you get this beautiful imagery that Mary untied the knot that Eve had tied. And why that concept's, worthy of its own conversation, I think what it showed me is like, as a typical, Protestant, I had qualms with some of the like, big 4 or 5 issues that are always there, right? Excuse me. We deal with the Pope, purgatory, Mary, praying to the saints, indulgences, confession. There's these things that kind of like agitate. If you grow up in like a Protestant background, they agitate you because you can't immediately see them in Scripture. And you don't know if they're man-made or not, or et cetera. And so a lot of his writings that early on the importance of Mary in that kind of typological setting of understanding the New Testament as a new Genesis, and kind of completing, I think, a lot of the thoughts that St. Paul had of Christ as a new Adam. That one was very, very helpful to me. I should mention to those following along that if you're not familiar with the website New Advent, New Advent has a lot of the early church father documents for free online in a pretty good library. So if you're looking at a place to start, I think that would be a good place. I do want to pivot though, to Eternal Christendom. So you have launched a new project that is very, very exciting. I am honored to be on your advisory board. And so I'm very happy to help however I can. So let me kind of tee this up a little bit, and then you can tell us about Eternal Christendom. So you want to, first off, there's a great website, eternalchristendom.com. Everyone should go visit it. I think it's a beautiful website. So well done. And I want to read your vision because I thought this was really fascinating. So the vision of Eternal Christendom is the preservation and revival of the great tradition for future generations by adapting it from the bare texts of former ages into the most engaging and beautiful media of our time, utilizing all the artistic and digital tools available to us in the 21st century. And so, one thing here that I think is interesting about Eternal Christendom is it couples something that typically don't go together. So typically these groups that get together that want to revitalize the old text, or even like Ascend, where it's like, here's the great books, these types of things typically tend to stay away from the digital media, right? They don't lean heavy into that. We almost see it as a necessary evil,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like, well, if I want to tell people about the great books, I have to use this podcasting, thing, and it's kind of a necessary evil.
Yeah.
Eternal Christendom seems to very much have jumped into, no, we need to take this wisdom and kind of transliterate it into the media platforms that we have today. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, well, read the mission statement too, if you don't mind. It's similar, but the vision is like what we want to see, and the mission is a little bit more specifics about how we see ourselves doing it. So, would you mind reading that as well?
Of course.
They're both.
Free-
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Creating a platform
Yeah,
that recruits the greatest thinkers, teachers, artists, poets, musicians, and filmmakers to preserve and revive the great tradition through the creation of the most engaging and beautiful books ever made, and integrating them with all the audio, visual, and interactive tools of the digital world.
yeah. So that one's important because it has more specifics, and it makes clear that we're not talking about doing away with the physical or the text, right? In fact, I think it'll be quite a while before we get the full range of digital tools and resources that we ultimately want to have. So yeah, Eternal Christendom is if you look at the logo, we in both of those statements, I have a communications mentor. He's worked with presidents and Supreme Court justices, whatever, and he's done media training for them. Really brilliant guy. So he has a 50 words or less rule. You've got to communicate your objective in 50 words or less. So both of those statements are 50 words or less. But it's an extremely helpful rule. So free tip from one of the best in the business for anybody out there. Really, really helps focus the mind. And so, I'll start with when I was 19. Deacon, you've probably read this book. I guess I should include Adam too. You're just being quiet, so I keep forgetting that you're there sometimes. So Deacon, I'm sure Adam, maybe you've read it too. Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death." Have you guys read it?
Yeah, I have. And is what's the other one? It's on technology. Technology.
He's written a few others. I admit I haven't read those in full. I think "Amusing Ourselves to Death" has been the most impactful one. But anyway, it was published in 1985, so before internet, before laptops, before smartphones, before all the Pandora's box of devices we have. And he was basically arguing that electronic media was making us dumber. That's the short version. Mm-hmm. And he traces the phenomena in three areas: politics, religion, and education. And I think he makes an extremely convincing case. And he was using the fact that we had just passed 1984, the eponymous title of George Orwell's great book about sort of totalitarian world government, or at least two world governments, from what I recall. It's been a while since I've read it. And he's comparing and contrasting George Orwell's vision of like a totalitarian, jackboot on your face for all eternity view of the future, dystopian view of the future, and Aldous Huxley's more pleasure-driven, hedonism-driven view of the future in Brave New World. And basically says in his introduction, we have it on the website in the About section, I kind of explain this whole story. But he basically says Orwell thought we would be destroyed by what we hate. Aldous Huxley thought we'd be destroyed by what we love. This book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. And so that book had a profound impact on me because I've always loved to read, and it's a grace. I can claim zero credit. I've just always loved to read since I was a little boy. In fact, I'm slowly but surely going to bed at a more healthy time, because since I've been a boy, I've been a night owl because I just love to read. And when my mom said, "All right, lights out, got school tomorrow," I would wait till she was gone. I would take a towel down, I would put it on the slit at the bottom of the door so no light would get out. I'd turn the light back on and go back to reading. So I would do that a lot. And it was fun, but it built up some bad habits, which I am almost conquering now. So anyway, but it came from God. It's just I was insatiably curious, which of course can be a vice. Now I know that, but no, overall I think it was a good thing. And so, but I saw all around me. I think Postman's thesis was becoming even more true right before my eyes with the advent of these things. And I am thankful. We were joking before we started the podcast that all of us, you guys are 37. I'm very close to being 36. Maybe by the time this podcast posts, I will be. but that we were all born in the sane half of the millennial generation. But I think we really were. Our part of the millennial generation may have been the last to grow up without a totally digital childhood, because smartphones came out my freshman year of college, your guys' sophomore, assuming you went to college right after high school. And I am so thankful I didn't get it before I was 18. I have teacher friends who tell me about the effect of this in the classroom. Teacher friends who were mentors of mine in high school. And if my mom's a teacher as well, so she's seen the changes too over a 20-year period or so. And they have said it's been profound and frightening in so many ways. That could be a whole other discussion. But things like attention span, narcissism, a sense of insecurity, because I'm sure you guys are aware, when we're sharing, we tend to put our best face forward on social media. So we see that from other people and we assume everybody else's lives are just wonderful and we just can't possibly measure up and whatever. So this is particularly affecting young girls. It's affecting everybody, but young girls. At my high school alone, Rockland High School, in Northern California, I don't recall a single suicide in my 4 years. Almost every year, the last few years, there's 3 to 5 now. So something has changed. Something has very, very much changed. That could be a whole discussion. But my point is I felt Postman's thesis not only made sense in the abstract, but I was seeing it in real time. And that this obsession, I think these things can be used for good. Here we are on a video app that is helping us, talk about the great books and talk about the true, the good, and the beautiful. But what these things do is they habituate us to short-term gratification, and they habituate us to wanting an instant gratification. And it's not that any of the things we're doing to do that are intrinsically bad or sinful. Watching a few funny reels is not in and of itself sinful. If it consumes your whole day and you don't do what you're supposed to do, then it would be sinful. But even when it's not sinful, you're habituating yourself to being a purely passive receptor of information and images and sound. So when we read a great book, most of those great books don't have pictures. It's actually very interesting. I saw the Lord of the Rings movies. I had not read the books beforehand. And I love the Lord of the Rings movies. And I went to go read the books. And the first time I read them, I couldn't stand them. And I think I really could. There were parts of it that I thought were great, but he was just so descriptive, so much detail. And I already had all the images in my head, right? I was just taking what he was writing and transplanting it onto the world created by Peter Jackson. So it's I don't need all those details. Just move on, But of course, the reason Peter Jackson was able to do that was because of all the details he wrote. And so I was fed up with it. So I was like, enough. But the point is that when you're reading Lord of the Rings with hardly any pictures, your imagination has to work to produce this phantasm in your mind. When you're watching a movie, again, there's nothing wrong or sinful with this, but when you're watching a movie, you are passively receiving all those images to you. Your imagination doesn't have to work, right? So that fundamentally habituates us in different ways. It doesn't mean film is wrong or sinful. And Postman wasn't a Luddite, meaning somebody who just wanted to go back in technology. He was saying what we need to realize, however, is that technology is not neutral. We need to realize how these things affect us. And so I've basically been concerned, from the days of going deeply into the founding fathers and into the church fathers, how do we get people to read this in a way that is where you basically you meet people where they are, and where people are these days is, I think, threefold. One, the most visual generation in history. Human beings have always been susceptible to trusting our eyes too much, but we're the most visual generation in history by far. We're the most digital generation in history. And I think we're the most orphan generation in history, meaning we're now several generations in to the systematic destruction and wiping out of the great tradition from the educational inheritance, if you can even call it that at this point, that we're given. And so you've got the most orphan, the most visual, and the most digital. So look, I don't need the pictures. I don't need the beauty. I love it, but I'm insatiably curious. So I'm going to read it anyway. I suspect you guys are the same. That's not most people. And so if you don't take into account these three things, that they're orphaned. So here's an example of what I mean by orphan. And this is partially why I did the Federalist Papers thing. When you read the Federalist Papers, it refers to a whole bunch of people, places, and events that the modern reader won't have a clue what it's referring to. And I have bought multiple versions of the Federalist Papers now, Oxford, Cambridge, Barnes & Noble, multiple versions. Not one of them has explanations of these things. Not one. Why? It takes zero accounting of the orphan nature of this generation. And by the way, when I say this generation, I don't just mean Zs. I mean people alive today. I think this goes back to boomers, really, which I do not mean as an insult in that particular sentence. I know it's becoming popular to use boomer as an insult. And that's the case, unfortunately, as you and I have talked about, Deacon, with many of the classic books. Some of them have some beautiful covers, and there's a few here and there that have illustrations here and there. But the vast majority of them are just not presented with any beauty. There's nothing. So why is beauty important? Because the visual, that gets to the second part. You've got the orphan part, you've got the visual part. And if you're not producing something that's visually beautiful, it's going to be all the more difficult to attract modern people, precisely because we're the most visual generation in history. But guess what?
Do you think can we parse this out with like an example? So let's take let's say Eternal Christendom, because I think I have a vision in my head, I think, of where you want to take this. So maybe let's use a concrete example that would help.
Sure.
So let's say Eternal Christendom is going to come out with an edition of St. Augustine's Confessions.
Yeah.
What does that look like, and why is it different than the 400 other translations of Augustine's Confessions that we have?
Sure. It looks different for a variety of reasons. We want to ultimately address all three of those: orphan, visual, and digital. So the orphan, the word engaging and the vision and the mission, that's what this is about. So engaging is actually explaining to the reader what they're reading. So when we're producing a version, can I use St. Ignatius's letters? Well, I could use that. I could use the confession. That's fine too. So if I would go through the confessions, when I'm looking through it to what we'll do, anything that St. Augustine refers to that a modern reader is very likely to not have a clue about, we're going to explain it, and we're going to do it in the book. I want to find artistic, fun ways to do it that aren't just footnotes. I don't have a problem with footnotes, but footnotes feel a little bit more academic-y. I'm sure we'll use them in some regards. But whether it's a footnote or a beautiful sidebar, a stylized sidebar, with Augustine as a expert in Roman rhetoric and whatnot, probably something that's kind of a Roman style or whatnot, we're going to explain what the reader is reading in succinct, convincing ways. I think part of the genius of teaching really well is being able to take complex things and express them succinctly. So we're going to try and do that as best we can. The second part is people have seen illuminated manuscripts for millennia. We produce those. And sometimes it wasn't to explain anything. It was just to make it gorgeous. But oftentimes it did. You would see pictures of the story and scripture you're reading. So when it comes to Augustine's Confessions, this is the easiest part, but we'll include artwork that's inspired by that. Augustine crying about the peach tree incident. We'll include that. The other thing I want to do is Eternal Christendom is kind of at the intersection of evangelism, apologetics, and classical education. So when we're engaging, I want to create versions of all the fathers that are as apologetics centered as possible. So I want to be pointing out every little thing that father is saying that's Catholic and why, and explaining it, and pointing it out and saying, here's where some of these verses are. Here's where Augustine's coming from. Here's some supporting evidence from other church fathers that shows what this is. Like Saint Monica in the Confessions, Saint Augustine says, she asked, basically, she felt her only purpose in life was to pray that her son becomes Catholic, and at that point, she felt her raison d'etre was fulfilled. And she says to Augustine, remember me at the altar. I couldn't say that as a Protestant. I couldn't say anything like that. I thought that was idolatry. I thought that was paganism. I thought that was, medieval accretions. But there it is in the 300s with St. Augustine and his mother. I actually visited Tunisia and saw a church that she prayed in. At least that's what I was told. It had been destroyed by the Muslims, but it was amazing to think, wow, she was praying for her son. And then I visited a destroyed ancient basilica that he received catechumens into the church. I walked down into the baptismal area, the remains of the pool that St. Augustine stood at and received new converts. Again, the whole thing is in ruins because it was all destroyed by the Muslims. But you can see the outlines of this building. It was massive. It was very, very big. And so I can send you pictures sometimes, but it was amazing. So anyway, so that's so things like that. We want to make it not only beautiful, like pleasing to the eye, but it's kind of like for anybody who's been to Rome, if you go to the Vatican or St. John Lateran or any of these places in Rome, you're kind of awed by the beauty overall, but then there's all these details that a master guide will point out to you. That, so one of my favorites, it's a bit morbid, but it's powerful, is in the Lateran, the statue of St. Bartholomew, because traditionally he was skinned alive. So the statue of St. Bartholomew, when you first look at it, it's like, this looks like something you'd see in a horror movie. But there's a reason why. And he's holding his skin, and you see just kind of the sinews of his muscles all over. But then the guide tells you, this is St. Bartholomew. And him holding his skin like that is him holding his triumph, his trophy, so to speak.
One thing I appreciate about your project, Joshua, is that you understand the role of beauty.
Yeah.
In it, and because I think that does get lost. It's funny. I actually sat in a lecture today about classical education, and that was one of the critiques that was given, that of the transcendentals, it's beauty that often is forgotten the most in education, which is kind of hilarious because in our culture overall, you can tell that we're starved for beauty.
Oh yeah,
and that we satiate in it in all the wrong ways, and then when we do find it, we become gluttons. And a lot of my Twitter ministry is about such things. But
yeah,
I appreciate that Eternal Christendom has taken up the mantle of beauty to understand that these texts not only need, but in certain ways deserve a beautiful treatment to present their ideas well. I think that's very good. Can you explain, though, a little bit about how the digital side gets incorporated?
Yep. So no, exactly. So we've got the orphan part. The orphan part is you don't assume the reader knows the context of this work. Okay. The engaging part is you actually explain it to them. The beautiful part is obviously all the things we just talked about. Now the digital part, this is going to take a lot more time, but as the vision and the mission statement talked about, I think we need to integrate the physical and the digital worlds. And so I'll give an example. Here's my smartphone. So if this is a book and I open the book, let's say it's a Confessions, and there's a QR code for every chapter or whatever, I scan it. It opens up the Eternal Christendom. We're calling it the digital cathedral. And it opens that up. And so for that chapter or for that work, I suddenly have at my fingertips, this is just me dreaming. I did a longer post on X, kind of dreaming out loud. I actually use Augustine City of God, so it would have worked for Confessions too. But you get well done professional audio of that entire work. Now there is audio out there of some of these works, some of the more famous ones, but generally speaking, it sucks. That's my opinion. And it's not professionally done, and it's not usually available on the biggest platforms like YouTube and Spotify. It's like on these very particular Catholic websites or whatever. So there is some out there, but they're usually have the more important works. We want everything, frankly, because I think it'd be amazing. So actually, let me use Saint Ignatius of Antioch's letters because they're much shorter than Confession. So there's 6 short letters, and it's going to be the first one we do. And I want it to be the first one we do because Saint Ignatius of Antioch, I jokingly call him Saint Ignatius the Red Pill, because if you have an open-minded Protestant read him and you're like, oh my goodness, this guy knew the apostles and he's saying things that are profoundly Catholic. Maybe he knows something I don't, which is what I assumed as well, and you as well, obviously. And so, so if you're reading St. Ignatius' letters, let's say you finish up the letter to the Ephesians, and you're about to go to the Smyrnians, but you've got to go to work. So you go to Smyrnians, you scan the QR code, opens up the app, you listen to it, you put it on your car, and all of a sudden you can keep listening to St. Ignatius, and you've reached the modern person through a medium that they are very familiar with and very comfortable with, and which St. Ignatius' letters are currently not contained in. So you've made it infinitely easier for the modern person in today's media to connect with St. Ignatius of Antioch, who has done so much to help people come to the Catholic Church. That's the low end. That's the easy part of the digital side. Again, this is me dreaming, but I think it's possible, and I think the vision is big enough for big patrons to come alongside and do it. Just like the patrons who produced most of this beautiful music, art, literature, statues, churches, whatever, that we still admire to this day. That secular people who don't believe a lick about Catholicism still spend thousands of dollars to take their whole family over to the other side of the planet and only look at that stuff. That was all produced by patronage, okay? Generous, frankly, wealthy Catholics who we're going to call upon too. We want to say, look, enough's been spent on elections and all this stuff. Put it to something like this, that'll last hopefully, for much longer. So anyway, we want to bring in filmmakers. We create trailers for the most trifling nonsense. Let's do it for some of the greatest things that have ever been written or said. So I want
that'd be great.
I want filmmakers to do a trailer for the Confessions. But not just for the Confessions, but for St. Augustine himself. There's one letter. This would be an example. This trailer doesn't have to be long, but there's this letter that St. Augustine wrote to the people of Maudara or something. It's a M-A. I've posted this letter several times. So section 3 of that letter, he's writing to the people. I think he's writing to the Catholics there. And he's basically pointing out all the things that have happened in history over the last 300-400 years that confirm the prophecies in the Old Testament. He's pointing to the church. He's pointing to heresies and schisms. He's saying this was all predicted by the Old Testament. He points to the dispersion of the Jewish people and the destruction of the temple. He said this was all predicted, and it's happening. And the final thing he points to is he basically, in a very kind of prolix sentence, but it's very powerful. He gives this powerful image. He basically points out, and the formerly pagan emperors that persecuted us are now, the formerly most powerful men in the world. He uses language like that. Now remove their crowns and bow in supplication at the tomb of the fishermen. That's a powerful image. We need to show that as an image. I want a trailer just for that, just for his description.
One point of clarification. Do you guys plan, like we talked about the great texts, we've mainly talked about an early church father context. Are you doing great books in general? Like, are you going to do something on Plato? Or are you going to do the Bible?
Absolutely.
Are you going to do medieval work?
Yeah.
I mean, so it's just everything.
Yeah. Well, not quite everything. We'll say that we say books that were created by or formed saints, sages, and statesmen. Sages is a little ambiguous, and that's good because it's kind of a catch-all. But so a sage, I think a good example would be someone like Boethius. So he's not considered a saint. I wouldn't be surprised if he is a saint, but he's a philosopher, right? And the constellation of philosophy is a beautiful.
I would argue that he's a saint.
Maybe I'm just because the church doesn't officially recognize it, right? But that'd be an example of someone who would be in that category. Another sage, he'd be a statesman too, but someone like Cicero or Plato. Plato would be a sage. Aristotle would be a sage. So if you look at this is what's so cool. So, I think a lot about it is cool. But when you look at the logo, And I'm getting this straight from St. Augustine, from St. Cyril of Alexandria. I provide quotes from them. They basically point out that over our Lord's cross, there was Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And basically, both of them come up with a very similar conclusion. And they're saying that God is basically declaring that Christ, the Logos, is the Lord of essentially revealed religion, philosophy, and civilization. That's the shortest way to put it. And so in the logo, you see a cross in the middle, and you see the 10 Commandments up top, Aleph and Bet, which Hebrew is read from right to left. So that's why it's Aleph and Bet, which second. That's the first letter and the second letter of the. So the first tablet and the second tablet. Love God, love neighbor. That's all that. On the lower right is the Parthenon, representing Athens and Greece. This tradition of philosophy and how far the human mind was capable of getting without divine revelation yet. It hadn't, didn't have the laws of Moses. Christ hadn't come yet, but they were able to get astoundingly far on a number of things. And then finally, in the lower left, the Colosseum, which represents Rome, and the fact that our Lord came into the world at a time when St. Paul called the fullness of time. And many fathers talk about the providential nature of this, that Rome had pacified an empire at the intersection of 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. So people were able to travel far more quickly over the Roman roads than they'd ever been able to. And they could do so, at least when Jesus came into the world, without fear of marauders or being attacked or whatever. So yes, it would be a set of classic books that would not include things like Jane Eyre or Charles Dickens, as great as those are. It would be works that come from this great tradition, from Greece, from Rome, and from Christendom itself. There's a version of Thomas's Summa that I want to do. We can talk about that later. I basically want to do a version where it's not arranged by prima and prima secunda, all that. I want to arrange it by treatise, So the treatise on the law is its own volume. The treatise on the angels is its own volume. The treatise on justice is its own, because you can arrange it in a way that I think is much more logical and much more, still follows the same order that St. Thomas does, but just puts it in a different set of volumes. And you can do it in a way that's very focused on that subject. So yeah, church fathers. There's great classics in the political realm that many, like among my favorites. Have you guys heard of Sir John Fortescue, The Law and Governance of England? Yeah, 1400s, Chancellor of England. Deacon, are you familiar with the genre of advice to princes, like that whole genre?
The Mirror of Princes.
Yeah, so Erasmus does a good one. This is what Fortescue's work is. It's basically telling the King of England what's special about England. And of course, he's comparing and contrasting it with France and saying how bad the French are, of course. But yeah,
great. Thomas wrote a good mirror.
Yes.
Erasmus has one. Obviously, the most famous one is The Prince by Machiavelli.
Yep.
Yeah, they're a fun little genre because they tend to be short and practical because they're writing to actual rulers. Yeah, it's a fun genre.
So I want us to do those as well. So, but yeah, I mean, it's going to be a lot. So we're a very small team. We've just got started. It's going to take a lot of resources.
What's your first book?
St. Ignatius of Antioch. The Letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch.
Why did I ask that? I should have known that just from this conversation.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, no, that one would be the first. I think the second one would be St. Vincent's Commonatory. Again, because it's very short, and we want to show patrons. We want to invest a lot of money into doing it as well as we possibly can to show them we want to do this at scale, essentially. It's going to take, frankly, I'm 30, almost 36. If I live a normal lifespan, I think this will take the rest of my life, assuming Christ doesn't come back before then. It's going to take a while, but the goal is that what we produce will be so good that people will want to keep it and build their library with it.
Good. I'm very happy that some other project is on like the 40-year cycle. So I think at the moment, Ascend, the Great Books podcast, is going to hit Dante's Divine Comedy in 20 years. So
I was going to say, if you guys are doing a whole year for one work, I mean, that's awesome, but it's going to take a while to get through some of them.
Yeah,
it's going to take a little bit.
Yeah,
we've got our year.
There
are
so many works that I want to I want to get to that I know I will probably die before we have a chance. My son will end up taking over Ascend the Great Books podcast before I get a chance to actually get to it. Which
that's beautiful.
Praise God.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get there. So on the website, which by the way, again for everyone is eternalchristendom.com, you have a separate section called Becoming Catholic.
Yeah.
And so for those who might not be Catholic and are kind of interested in these kind of multi-year bite-sized fact-focused attempts to describe, I think, a journey from Protestantism to Catholicism.
Yeah.
And it's arranged by topics. So if you're like, well, I don't understand the Eucharist or the papacy, or, what's the Jewish roots of the Catholic Church, you have it arranged here via topic, and people can kind of click on it. And looks like there's several resources per category, which is wonderful. One of the ones that you drew our attention to is the category of where is the true church?
Yeah.
And you have 2 lessons up here from St. Augustine on where is the true church. One against the fundamental epistle of Manichaeus, and the second one is of true religion. Why don't you kind of introduce the of true religion one to us and tell us why it stands out?
Yeah, of true religion is a short work of St. Augustine. Maybe I got to reduce when Adam was saying his was much longer. So maybe, I don't know. But in the version that I have is quite short, maybe 100 pages at most. And I'm forgetting who he's writing to, but St. Augustine is basically writing about where you can find true religion. And he says the Catholic Church and only the Catholic Church. And the reason why it struck me so much, it's a lesser known work. Excuse me. But it's not only in how he describes the church, which continues to be true, but how he describes those who broke away from it. And of course, when I first read it, I was Protestant. And once again, like St. Vincent, he was describing in great detail things that were accurate about what I thought Christianity was, but he was calling it heresy and schism. And so again, that was very, very sobering. That was a very, very common experience in reading the Fathers. And so how do you guys normally do it? Do you actually read through different parts of the text and then discuss it?
Well, I think for our purposes here and for the purposes of kind of time, because I think our main purpose here was to introduce you and your story and Eternal Christendom. Why don't you just point out what's the main, the single most main lesson of this text that you'd like if you're people, if you read this text that I've summarized on my website of true or on true religion, what's an example of the main principle that you would pull out of it?
He covers a lot. I think I could reduce it to believe the Catholic faith and remain in the Catholic Church. That's essentially what it is. And he describes how heretics and schismatics violate this. It's very interesting. St. Augustine and other fathers, one of the things that I was confused by as a Protestant is sometimes when I was at higher church denominations, sometimes they'd read the creed. And that creed says one holy Catholic and apostolic church. And I was confused by most of those words. I was like, how does this apply to us? And I said, I thought we weren't Catholic. And the answer I would always get, and you'll still hear many Protestants say today, is, oh, we're little c Catholic. And so I accepted that, because people I trusted and respected, and I still respect many of them a lot, told me so, and so I believed it. That became impossible when I actually read the fathers who wrote the creed and defended it. That was not basically how Protestants would explain the word Catholic. Is it's a general reference to all believers. Okay. That's not at all what the fathers said. Because when a Protestant's thinking that, he's thinking the Methodists and the Baptists and the Lutheran and the Calvinists, who have very contrary beliefs about many different things. Whether you can lose your salvation, whether divorce is allowable, baptismal regeneration, works in their role in salvation, whether you should baptize children. I mean, there's many, many things, structure of the church. There's many, many fundamental things on which these different sects of Protestantism disagree. And so, but they could all be included in the word Catholic, according to this rendering of this word in the creed. But when you read the fathers, that's not at all what the fathers believe. The fathers believe that to be Catholic is to assent to the one Catholic faith, to worship in a Catholic manner, and to be part of one society that is known to the world, and it's visible, known as the Catholic Church. And Catholic, it technically means of the whole, but that's the shorthand is like universal. It's a universal
Right.
church. And the church, actually, my patron saint, St. Ignatius of Antioch, is the first time we have this term in the documentary record of Catholic Church. And the reason he was using it, and I don't think he was the first one to use it, but he's the first one in the documentary record. And obviously, the further back you go, the fewer documents we have, just because time and its ravages. But the reason why the church started using this term universal was precisely because from the very beginning, I mean, you see descriptions of this in Scripture itself, there are groups breaking away from unity. And to distinguish itself from those groups, because everyone's saying we're Christian. To distinguish itself, the true church, from all those breakaway groups, the church called itself Catholic, universal. And it has kept that name ever since, literally from the first century. Ignatius wrote at the beginning of the second century. I say the first century because he was 60 or 70 years after Christ's ascension. So Christianity was less than 100 years old before this term begins and doesn't stop until today, okay? And it was to distinguish itself. Now, what were some of these breakaway groups? And St. Augustine in Of True Religion describes this in various places. Basically, you had to, again, as we said earlier, you had to be under a bishop, and this bishop had to have a succession that goes straight back to the apostles. And if they didn't, they weren't in the true church. St. Irenaeus talks about this, and he's very, very clear about this. And this is universal in the fathers. Absolutely. I've not seen a single father that contradicts this or whatnot. And so heretics would break away from this lineal succession of bishops, and they would roll out their lists. St. Irenaeus of Lyon refers to the lists of bishops. He's able to go to these churches, and these churches keep their lists, and they provide a set of names that go all the way back to Peter or all the way back to Paul or whoever. And so that's why St. Augustine says, there's one part he says, this being so, religion is to be sought neither in the confusion of the pagans, nor in the offscourings of the heretics, nor in the insipidity of schismatics, nor in the blindness of the Jews, but only among those who are called Catholic or Orthodox Christians, that is, guardians of truth and followers of right. Another thing he points out is, and this goes back to your earlier question, if I could read, it's a paragraph, but it wouldn't take me too long to read, but I think it's really, really important. It goes back to Adam's earlier question about did reading about conflicts and issues in the church prevent or help you become Catholic? And I emphatically said they helped me become Catholic. And St. Augustine played a huge role here. Many other fathers did too. But the fathers are full of typology of the church that explain two things extremely well. On the one hand, it explained the necessity and what certainly seems like Christ's very strong promises that the church will in some sense be maintained in teaching the truth. It will never be defeated. Like this is a society founded by God. This is not the Roman Empire founded by a fratricidal murder of, not particularly well-bred young boys, referring to Romulus and Remus. This is not Athens. This is not the United States of America. The church is a society founded by God. And unfortunately, when I was reading the fathers, particularly Augustine, that's how they talk about the church, as a society founded by God. My kingdom is not of this world. That's what it means in the truest sense. It's founded by God, not by men. And so, I realized by reading the fathers, I as a Protestant was thinking of the church like I thought of any other society, like any other society that was not founded by God, that was just founded by men, and therefore didn't have a guarantee to continue to exist from its point of origin to the end of time. So St. Augustine and the fathers open up this typology, so they cover that, the need for stability and not being defeated by hell and being guided into all truth, all these promises Jesus makes to the church. But then also the reality for the church militant, the church on earth, that there's sin. We struggle with sin. We have concupiscence. There are wolves. There are Judases. While Jesus promises to always maintain the church guided into all truth, He also prophesies that there will be wolves and there will be scandals. And he says, scandals must come, but woe to those by whom they come. And in other places, better that a millstone is thrown around their neck than that they, deceive any of these little ones, I think is how it's phrased. And so Jesus gives us both, and the fathers provide the typology for both. So here's some examples of what they use. And St. Augustine uses this one in Of True Religion, wheat and chaff. So when you look at Jesus's parable of wheat and chaff, there's this one field of the Lord where the seed of God is planted, and the wheat starts growing up. But then among the wheat are the chaff, the weeds essentially. And the disciples ask him, Lord, should we remove those weeds? And the Lord says, nope, let them grow together, lest that you remove the weeds, you also remove the wheat. Let them grow together, and they'll be separated at the end. So you see this all over Scripture. Another example that St. Augustine and many fathers use is Noah's Ark, because Noah's Ark is a type of the church. Peter talks about this. And in Noah's Ark, you have two of every kind of animal, and you have clean and unclean animals, according to the later Torah. So they point to that as an example of righteous and unrighteous being in the one ark. And then at the end of the flood, they separate, okay? Another one that St. Augustine uses a lot is it's not a parable, but it's the episode in the Gospel of John. I think it's after our Lord is risen, and they're fishing at the Sea of Galilee. And he says, put out your net, and they pull on the net, and there's one net, and it says it's bursting with fish, but it doesn't break, which the fathers refer to the unbreakable nature of the church. And then he says, then you spread out the fish, and you put them in the good pile and put them in the bad pile. So it's the same thing. The wheat and the chaff, the good and the bad fish are separated at the end of time. And one of the things that St. Augustine said that was very powerful for me, he says this in many, many places. He essentially says that heretics and schismatics seek to separate the wheat and the chaff, the good fish and the bad fish, the clean and the unclean, the sheep and the goats, before Christ's return. I thought that was very, very interesting. And Augustine thought this was literally impossible because there's only one church started by Christ, the Catholic Church, and you're in it through hell or high water, quite literally sometimes. So in particular with this wheat and chaff example here, can I just read this paragraph really quick? That be right? Okay. He says, this is section 10 of True Religion. He says, this Catholic Church, strongly and widely spread throughout the world, makes use of all who err to correct them if they are willing to be aroused and to assist its own progress. There's development of doctrine there. That'd be a whole other discussion. It makes use of the nations as material for its operations, of heretics to try its doctrine, of schismatics to prove its stability, of the Jews as a foil to its own beauty. Some it invites, others it excludes, some it leaves behind, others it leads. To all it gives power to participate in the grace of God, whether they are as yet to be formed or reformed, admitted for the first time, or gathered in anew. Convert or revert. Its own carnal members, those whose lives or opinions are carnal, sinful essentially, it tolerates as chaff, the weeds, by which the corn is protected on the floor until it is separated from its covering. On this floor, I'll come back to this, the threshing floor. On this floor, everyone voluntarily makes himself either corn or chaff. Therefore, every man's sin or error is tolerated until he finds an accuser or defends his wicked opinion with pertinacious animosity. Those who are excluded return by way of penitence, the sacrament of confession, or in baleful liberty sink into wickedness as a warning to us to be diligent, or they cause schisms to exercise our patience, or they beget a heresy to try our intelligence or to quicken it. By such ways, carnal Christians leave us, for they could neither be corrected nor endured. So you see Augustine refer to the wheat and the chaff. I think it's translated as corn here, but it's everywhere else I've seen it's wheat. So wheat and chaff on the one floor. What is he referring to? He's referring to the threshing floor. Now, what's the threshing floor? In the Old Testament, David buys the threshing floor. I'm forgetting the fellow's name he bought it from. The threshing floor was a flat area where you would basically crush the wheat and you'd separate the germ from the chaff. Okay. And the threshing floor ended up being where the temple was put. So this is Mount Moriah. And David didn't build the temple, Solomon did, but this is the threshing floor. And so any reference to it in the Old Testament references the site where the temple was built. What's the temple? it's the church. James talks about this in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, that the church is the one temple of the Lord, and the prophecies in Daniel 2, Isaiah 2, multiple places throughout the scriptures refer to that in the last days. This isn't Antichrist days, but when Messiah comes, the mountain of the Lord, this is where the temple is, the threshing floor, will spread to the whole world. And so Augustine refers to that here. It spread widely throughout the world. This is a point he made with a lot of heretics and schismatics. He said, look, the Catholic Church is in all these places. Your heresy was a local thing. And every heresy has invariably started that way, whether it was Arianism in Alexandria, Egypt, or Anglicanism in England, or Lutheranism in Germany. It's like none of these things are Catholic. None of these things are universal. As a Protestant, I used to think, the Pope invented all this stuff. Unfortunately, I was finding Christians in India and Ethiopia and the East who believed pretty much exactly the same thing we do on all the topics that I, as a Protestant, thought was inventions of the papacy. That just simply wasn't true. So anyway, that's an example where St. Augustine's typology is very powerful, because he essentially says you need to be on the one threshing floor of God, because this is where the one temple is. And he says here and in many other places, you can be chaff one day, but through deciding to convert, deciding to repent, you can go from a carnal member to wheat. And he says, those of you who are wheat in the Catholic Church, you need to put up with the chaff. You don't separate from them before Christ separates them, because that's what heretics and schismatics do. So anyway, he has many, many other things in here where he talks about this phenomena.
Let me
sure.
jump in there, because I do think there's a few things worth noting. So
Sure.
One, because I think that there's a mindset shift here that I think sometimes, when I was Protestant, it was difficult to see, because there are certain presuppositions about Christianity that are different. And I think one of them for Catholicism is that unity and charity cannot actually be separated from one another.
Yes.
And so we see this in John 17 when our Lord prays for his church in the garden. And he says very clearly, he prays for the church that we would be one, like he and the Father are one, right? So this deep and abiding unity. And then he says, the reason that we have this unity, what it does is it's through our unity that the world then believes in our charity.
Yeah.
And this is really a lesson I think that we have walked away from, right? Because we, whether it's because we're Americans or simply because we're modern men or we're habituated by liberalism, whatever it is, we're very comfortable with there being many different versions of Christianity. And we, somewhat pick up this idea of just like, we agree on the basics, and therefore there's like this broad unity, kind of that small c Catholic you talked about earlier. I think it's really hard to actually read Christ's prayer and think that would be permissible. And so I think that the text that you've picked here at times can seem very harsh, but actually is really holding to this principle that our Lord gave us, in which our unity and our charity can't be separated. We can't be fragmented in our church structures, in our ecclesial societies, and our faith communities, and then tell the world, listen, we all love and obey Jesus Christ, right? There's a disconnect there that I think that we've become very accustomed to. So sometimes we forget that I think it's disjointed from what our Lord asked us. And the thing too, I also found in this text, because again, like we don't talk like this anymore. So anytime you start talking about schismatics or heretics or things like this, it can be very agitating. But the one thing that I really noticed in the text was this, that it's actually a text of mercy. Like St. Augustine is actually really asking the true church to have mercy on these people, particularly on the people who are inside the church, but struggling, right? Don't become heretics and leave because they're sinners, right? Because we have to think in this time period, for us today, when we think about people separating from the Catholic Church, it's never because they want to be more strict.
No.
Right. No one ever leaves and says, you know what, the Catholic Church, you just don't have enough rules. I want more rules.
I'd say a small minority, maybe. Like there are some set of a contest and whatever. But yes, in general, most people who leave are they're getting loosey.
Somewhere there's some human that has done that recently. Yeah. But for the most part, that's not what we see today. But in the early church, it actually was what we saw. Right? People would separate from the Catholic Church because the church was too lenient. Like these sinners didn't belong in the same place as them. And so I do think, even though it uses language that sometimes we're not accustomed to, particularly if we're not used to reading Augustine and the early church fathers, it really actually is a text of mercy asking the church to abide these people,
Hmm.
those suffering inside the church, and that there's a use for those outside the church that ultimately terminates in them coming inside the church,
Yeah.
right? And that really it is an invitation to have patience with those who are on their journey to the Lord, right? And to not
Yeah.
allow them to become a stumbling block.
Yep.
And so I like the text a lot. I mean, it does, we're not used to the language. Sometimes it can be jarring and hit us in the face a little bit. But I think it's a beautiful text. And I think it has some very excellent lessons in it.
Well,
So Joshua,
oh,
as we take like we
yeah.
kind of take a high level look here, you've told us about your conversion story.
Yeah.
You've told us about your love of early church fathers. You told us about Eternal Christendom. Like we've looked at this. Like if people want to know more, they're listening to this and say, okay, I like this project. I want to know more about it. I want to help support it. Like I want to follow their good work. Like where do they go? What's the best way to engage you in your work?
Yeah, eternalchristendom.com. And there's if you want to become a patron, we don't call them donors. Donors are a bit more detached from it's implied they're a bit more detached from the work. We want patrons who are invested, and so there's a button, become a patron, at the top right. And then I'm on X, Joshua T. Charles. T as in Taylor. So do we have time for me to share two more quotes really quickly, or do you have to go?
I think we're getting pretty close to needing to go.
Okay.
We're getting pretty close.
All right.
But this is a good way for us to go. If they go to eternalchristendom.com, they can actually look at the text and be able to read it themselves.
Yes, that's true.
Right? Because
Okay,
you wrote
fair
the
enough.
article.
Yeah,
you wrote an article and pulled these quotes
Yeah.
out that we've been pulling through tonight, right? So like this is
Yeah.
an opportunity for them to actually go.
Yep.
Because there's a lot more in here. I would love we could have actually like another 2
Oh,
hour
yeah.
conversation.
This could be like
because
5 or
there's
6
actually
hours.
like
Yeah.
16 more things that I would love to talk
Yeah.
to you about
Yeah.
throughout this text.
Yeah.
Because it's so rich.
All right, you convinced me. All right.
But Deacon
Okay.
Garlic is right. Deacon Garlic is right.
It's an amazing work, though, and it yeah.
Yeah.
It talks
Yeah,
about how a Catholic will never separate from the church, and he puts up with all this. Like, I'll say very quickly, I sponsored some Mormons into the church last year, and when the mother came in, right when she had received our Lord, I think it was when she was confirmed. She hadn't received him yet. And she came and sat next to me, and I leaned over to her. She'd been baptized and confirmed. And I said, "Welcome to the biggest, most dysfunctional family in the whole world." And she laughed, and she's reminded me of that to this day. And when you understand the church as a family, and that you suffer with the family no matter what, and that's part of your sanctification, and that's part of taking up the cross, then everything in the Catholic faith makes sense. So
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for having me. This is great. I'm happy to come on any other time.
Yeah,
Maybe we can
yeah.
do a number 2 of this first ever sort of episode you've done. So
Yeah, that'd be great. And Joshua, like I'm so thankful that you are on our team and that you're in the church. The church is much better with you in it. And so I'm grateful for your conversion, for your witness, for your willingness to kind of step out here and do something that is like there's such a void in our culture today. And you saw the void and you said like, no, I'm willing to take this up and fill this void. So I'm incredibly grateful for your witness, not only on X, not only on all the work that you've done, but like in your desire and your foresight to be able to say like, no, Eternal Christendom, like that's where we need it. Like we need to be able to do this for not only our generation, but like,
Yeah.
you know, I'm a dad, like you had mentioned, like, but for my kids, cause like being it is going to be incredibly hard to have Christian values and pass them down to my kids. But it's even going to be even harder for my children to pass on the Christian values to their children, to my grandchildren, right? And so like a tree does not grow in a day. And so like when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But if you did not plant it 20 years ago, the best time to plant a tree is today.
Yeah.
And so I'm so grateful that you said yes to this work, and I plan on supporting it, and I encourage those who are listening right now to support it as well. I'm incredibly grateful for you.
Thank you.
And I hope to do this again very soon.
Thank you. Well, whatever good I've been or will be to the church, it's only because of the goodness she bestows upon me. So
Praise God.
No.
Hey, you guys have been listening to Ascend the Great Books podcast with Adam Minahan and Deacon Harrison Garlick. It has been a pleasure to have Joshua Charles. Go follow him on X at Joshua T. Charles. We will see you guys next week.
Thank you.